The gray, antiseptic-smelling water sloshed rhythmically in the bucket. Each swing of the mop was a study in practiced economy, a smooth arc of motion that left a gleaming, damp trail on the polished concrete floor of the Coronado gym. Vernon Ford worked in a world of his own creation, one defined by the steady swish of cotton fibers and the quiet satisfaction of a task done right. He was an old man, his back stooped from years of labor, his face a roadmap of wrinkles that spoke of a long, hard life. To the titans of muscle and sinew who crashed and sweated through this temple of strength, he was just part of the background, a ghost in a gray jumpsuit, as inanimate as the weight racks or the drinking fountain. The silence was shattered by the slam of the gym doors and the thunder of combat boots. Petty Officer First Class Cade Riley, known to his trainees as Hotshot, strode in, his chest puffed out with the unassailable arrogance of a 26-year-old who believed he was a god among men. He was flanked by a dozen SEAL candidates, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and adoration for the instructor leading them. They were sculpted from granite and grit, the absolute pinnacle of American military might, and they moved with the predatory grace of a wolf pack. Riley's eyes, chips of pale blue ice, scanned the empty gym and landed on the stooped figure of the janitor. A smirk played on his lips. He took a deliberate step off the rubber matting, his muddy boots leaving a series of ugly, brown prints directly across the path Vernon had just cleaned. It was a small act of desecration, a petty assertion of dominance. "Morning, Pops," Riley drawled, his voice loud enough for the whole platoon to hear. "Making things shiny for us. Appreciate it." The trainees snickered, a low rumble of masculine amusement. They saw what their instructor saw, a relic, a stooped old man past his prime, an object for casual scorn. What would you do in that recruit's boots? Would you laugh along, or would you see the quiet dignity in the old man's posture? Vernon Ford did not look up. He did not sigh. He did not offer a single flicker of reaction. He simply stopped his forward progress, turned around, and began the methodical process of mopping away the mud, his movements as calm and unhurried as before. He worked his way backward, erasing the insult one measured swipe at a time. This utter lack of response seemed to infuriate Riley more than any angry retort could have. It was a silent, profound rejection of his power. "Hey," Riley snapped, his voice sharper now. "I'm talking to you, old man. You deaf?" Vernon finished erasing the last muddy footprint, rinsed his mop head in the bucket with a precise, practiced motion, and wrung it out. Only then did he slowly straighten up, his joints protesting with a faint creak. He turned his head, and his eyes, a faded gray that had seen far too much of the world, met Riley's. They were calm, steady, and held a depth that the young SEAL couldn't begin to comprehend. "No, Petty Officer," Vernon said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I'm not deaf." He then turned back to his work, the brief exchange over, the dismissal absolute. Riley stood there, momentarily stunned by the sheer, unadorned simplicity of the rebuff. He felt a flush of anger creep up his neck. In his world, people jumped when he spoke. They snapped to attention. They did not dismiss him. He was an instructor of the world's most elite warriors. This man was a janitor. A nobody. He opened his mouth to say something else, something sharper and more cruel, but the moment had passed. He looked at his trainees, who were now watching with a new curiosity. To re-engage would be to admit the old man had gotten under his skin. So he just scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "Whatever. Let's hit the weights, boys. Don't mind the furniture." He swaggered off toward the squat rack, leaving Vernon alone with his mop and the lingering echo of disrespect in the vast, empty space. But the seed of a nasty fixation had been planted. Riley would not forget this. He would make the old janitor pay for his quiet defiance. The gym at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado was more than just a room with equipment. It was a crucible where boys were forged into legends. The very air was thick with the ghosts of past efforts, saturated with the smell of sweat, salt, chalk, and an intangible metallic tang of sheer willpower. Every scuff on the floor, every dent in the weights, was a testament to the thousands of hours of pain and sacrifice required to earn the trident. It was a hallowed space, and Cade Riley felt it was his personal kingdom. His campaign against Vernon Ford started small, escalating with the calculated cruelty of a bully testing his limits. The next day, a half-full protein shake was, accidentally, knocked over near Vernon's supply closet, its thick, chalky contents splattering across the floor and walls. Riley offered a theatrically insincere apology, clapping Vernon on the shoulder. "Sorry about that, Pops. My mistake. You got this, right?" The trainees watched, learning their lesson. Their instructor was teaching them about more than just combat, he was teaching them about the pecking order. A few days later, it was a pyramid of dumbbells, carefully stacked for morning inventory, that came crashing down just as Vernon was sweeping nearby. The noise was deafening, a clang of iron that echoed through the gym. Riley, feigning concern, immediately blamed the old janitor. "Pops, you gotta be more careful. You could have hurt someone." He made Vernon pick up every single weight, a task that took the better part of an hour for a man his age, his back groaning in protest with each lift. The trainees, eager to curry favor with their formidable instructor, began to join in. They started leaving their gear strewn across the floor, their wet towels draped over equipment, their empty water bottles rolling under benches. It was a silent conspiracy of disrespect, a collective effort to reinforce Vernon's status as the lowest man on the totem pole. He was no longer just a janitor, he was their janitor, a target for their casual contempt. Vernon became the focus of collective punishments, even for things he had no part in. If the locker room was untidy, Riley would roar, "The janitor obviously can't keep up. Guess you boys will have to help him out. Give me 50 burpees." The trainees would groan and drop to the floor, their resentment directed not at the instructor who gave the order, but at the old man who was the ostensible cause of their suffering. He was being systematically isolated, turned into an outcast within his own place of work. Through it all, Vernon remained an island of calm in a sea of hostility. He never complained. He never showed frustration. He simply absorbed the abuse with a quiet, unnerving stoicism. He cleaned the spilled shakes, restacked the fallen weights, and gathered the carelessly discarded gear. He performed each task, demeaning or not, with the same meticulous, unhurried precision. His movements were fluid, economical, betraying a lifetime of discipline that seemed utterly at odds with his station. This unbreakable resilience was what truly maddened Riley. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see the old man break, to plead, to get angry, to give him the satisfaction of a victory. But Vernon gave him nothing. It was like punching water. The old man's quiet dignity was a mirror, and in it, Riley saw only his own petty cruelty reflected back, a sight he couldn't stand. The more Vernon endured, the more determined Riley became to find his breaking point. The campaign of harassment was no longer just a casual sport, it had become an obsession. Lieutenant Commander Evans had an office with a large window overlooking the main training grounds, including a corner of the gym. He was a different breed of officer from men like Riley. Where Riley was all muscle and kinetic energy, Evans was thoughtful, academic. He was a student of history, tasked with ensuring the new generation of SEALs understood the lineage they were inheriting. He believed that true strength was tempered with wisdom and humility, qualities he found sorely lacking in many of the younger instructors. He first noticed the dynamic between Riley and the old janitor a few weeks into the harassment campaign. He watched through his window as Riley loudly berated the men for a supposed smudge on a mirror, his gestures theatrical and demeaning. Evans saw the old man just stand there, patiently waiting for the tirade to end, his posture one of quiet endurance. It was not the posture of a man being cowed, it was the posture of a man weathering a storm he knew would pass. It was intriguing. Evans started paying closer attention. He observed Vernon at work. He saw the way the janitor held his shoulders, the straightness of his back even when he was pushing a heavy cart. He noticed the man's gait, not the slow shuffle of an elderly civilian, but a measured, balanced tread that conserved energy. There was a military bearing to him, hidden under layers of age and a janitor's jumpsuit, but it was there. It was in his DNA. One afternoon, Evans saw Vernon taking a rare break, sitting on a bench outside the armory, slowly eating an apple. The sun caught the man's forearm as he lifted the fruit to his mouth. Evans saw it then, a faded tattoo, the ink blurred by decades of sun and sea, but the image still discernible. It was a crab, its claws menacing, holding a stick of dynamite. It was an old design, one Evans had only seen in history books. It wasn't the UDTs, Freddy the Frog, or the Seal Trident. It was something older, something primordial. His curiosity officially piqued, Evans went back to his office and pulled up the digital archives on his computer. He typed in keywords, frogman tattoo, crab dynamite, early naval demolition. After a few minutes of digging through grainy, black and white photos from a forgotten era, he found it. The insignia of the Naval Combat Demolition Units. The NCDUs. The legendary frogmen of World War II and Korea. The men who swam into enemy harbors with explosives strapped to their backs, the men who cleared the beaches under fire, the men who wrote the very first chapter of the book on American special warfare. A sense of profound cognitive dissonance washed over Evans. The men in those photos were hard-jawed legends, 20-year-old daredevils who did the impossible. And one of them was now the janitor being tormented daily by a puffed-up petty officer who thought he was the pinnacle of evolution. The file on Vernon Ford, custodial staff, was thin. It listed his start date, his pay grade, and not much else. There was no mention of prior service. Most of those old records were sealed, lost, or simply never digitized. The next day, Evans made a point of walking through the gym while Vernon was working. "Morning," Evans said, his tone respectful. Vernon paused his sweeping and nodded. "Sir," the use of the honorific was perfect, instinctual. "Just wanted to say you do a fine job keeping this place in order," Evans continued, trying to sound casual. "Must have seen a lot of guys come and go through here." "A few," Vernon replied, his voice noncommittal. His eyes were polite but guarded. He was not a man who invited conversation. Evans decided to be more direct. He gestured subtly toward Vernon's arm. "That's an old tattoo. Don't see many of those anymore." Vernon's gaze dropped to his own forearm, as if noticing the faded mark for the first time in years. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, he looked back at Evans, a flicker of something ancient and weary in his eyes. "It was a long time ago, sir," he offered no more, turning back to his sweeping, the conversation clearly over. The answer was evasive, technically true but completely incomplete. It deepened the mystery, confirming for Evans that this was no ordinary janitor. This was a man with a history, a man who had chosen to be forgotten. And Evans felt a growing sense of unease about what was happening to him in the open, right under their noses. The culmination of Riley's cruelty was set for a day on the demolition range. Lieutenant Commander Evans had designed a new training module focused on historical ordnance. His theory was that understanding the old ways of their forefathers would make the modern SEALs better, more adaptable operators. They needed to know how to defeat an enemy with nothing but their hands and their wits, not just with drones and high-tech sensors. The centerpiece of the training was a collection of inert, but fully functional, replicas of historical mines and explosive devices. Among them was a particularly nasty piece of work, a replica of a North Korean Box Type 3 magnetic sea mine from the early 1950s. It was a purely mechanical nightmare, a puzzle box of pressure plates, hydrostatic switches, and anti-tamper mechanisms that were notoriously difficult to disarm. It was designed to punish the arrogant and reward the patient. Petty Officer Riley, as the lead instructor for the day, saw the mine as a perfect opportunity to showcase his own expertise. He strode up to the device with his team of trainees gathered around, a cocky grin on his face. "All right, ladies, listen up. This is a museum piece. Your granddaddy's IED. Modern EOD would just countercharge this thing from a distance, but Lieutenant Commander Evans here wants us to play with it. So, let's play." He knelt beside the device, pulling out a sophisticated kit of electronic probes and fiber optic scopes. For the next 20 minutes, he prodded and poked at the replica. He tried to bypass the arming sequence with a magnetic jammer. The mine clicked ominously but did not disarm. He attempted to manually disable the primary detonator through an access port. A secondary lock engaged, blocking him. His initial confidence began to curdle into visible frustration. The purely analog nature of the device was baffling his 21st-century toolkit. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The trainees were watching him, their expressions shifting from admiration to confusion. Riley's entire persona was built on flawless execution and superiority. Failure was not an option, and it was happening in slow motion, right in front of his audience. Finally, after a particularly loud clack from the mine's internal mechanism signaled his complete failure, he stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This thing's a piece of junk," he declared, kicking a bit of dirt at the mine. "The replica is flawed. It's unrealistic. No one would ever have to deal with something this archaic." He needed a scapegoat, a way to deflect from his own incompetence. And then, he saw him. Vernon Ford was at the far end of the range, part of his duties including the monotonous task of policing the area for spent brass casings. He moved slowly, a bucket in one hand, his head bowed to his task. He was a perfect target. "Hey! Pops!" Riley yelled, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. The entire platoon turned to look. "Get over here." Vernon straightened up and walked slowly toward the group, his expression as placid as ever. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew it would not be pleasant. "You're an old-timer," Riley said, gesturing dismissively at Vernon. "Lived through the Stone Age. I bet you know all about this kind of old junk." He grabbed the heavy, specialized tools from his kit and shoved them unceremoniously into Vernon's hands. The weight almost made the old man stumble. "Show these boys how a real man from the good old days handles a bomb," Riley sneered. "Go on. We're all waiting." The trainees exchanged uneasy glances, but a few of them chuckled nervously, following their instructor's lead. It was a brutal, public setup. The challenge was impossible, designed for no other purpose than to utterly humiliate the old man and restore Riley's bruised ego. The stakes were clear, Vernon's dignity against Riley's authority. Vernon looked down at the complex, modern tools in his hands. He looked at the malevolent-looking sea mine. Then he looked up, his calm gray eyes meeting Riley's furious blue ones. There was no fear in his gaze. There was no anger. There was only a quiet, weary acceptance. He set the high-tech tools carefully on the ground, a silent rejection of Riley's methods. Then, with a simple, single nod, he accepted the gauntlet that had been thrown down. A hush fell over the demolition range. The hot California sun beat down, and the only sound was the distant cry of a seagull. Vernon Ford walked toward the replica mine, and with every step, a subtle transformation took place. The stooped, shuffling gait of the janitor vanished. His back straightened, his shoulders squared. The years seemed to fall away, replaced by an aura of profound, unshakable competence. He was no longer a custodian, he was an operator approaching a problem. He knelt beside the device, his movements deliberate and fluid. He ignored the discarded electronic kit completely. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his worn gray jumpsuit and pulled out a small, cracked leather roll, tied with a simple leather thong. He unrolled it on the ground beside him. Inside, nestled in worn felt loops, were not the tools of a janitor, but the simple, elegant instruments of a master craftsman, a few small wrenches, a set of fine-nosed pliers, a stethoscope with the rubber tubing yellowed from age, and a few strange, custom-made steel picks. They were old, but impeccably maintained. He placed the bell of the stethoscope against the cold steel casing of the mine. He closed his eyes. The entire platoon leaned in, mesmerized. They had been trained to rely on sensors and readouts, on data fed to a screen. They had never seen anything like this. Vernon was listening to the soul of the machine, to the faint clicks and whispers of its mechanical heart. His head was cocked, his expression one of intense concentration. After a full minute of silent listening, he picked up one of the steel picks. His hands, which had seemed stiff and arthritic while holding a mop handle, were now impossibly steady. With the delicate touch of a surgeon, he inserted the pick into a tiny, almost invisible seam in the mine's casing. He manipulated it, a slight twist here, a gentle nudge there. There was a soft, satisfying snick. He had just bypassed the first anti-tamper device, one that Riley's electronic probes had failed to even detect. He continued to work in this profound, instructional silence. He used a small wrench to turn a recessed bolt a quarter turn counterclockwise, then back an eighth. He listened again with the stethoscope. He chose another tool. It was a dance of immense precision and profound institutional knowledge. He was not just disarming a bomb, he was communing with it, speaking a language that had been forgotten by nearly everyone on the planet. He found and disabled a secondary booby trap, a mercury switch designed to detonate the mine if it was tilted, a trap that was not in the technical schematics Evans had provided. Vernon knew it was there because he had seen it before, decades ago, in the cold, dark waters off the coast of a war-torn country. The entire process took 1 minute and 47 seconds. He made one final adjustment, and a loud thunk echoed from inside the device. The disarming indicator, a small metal tab, popped out. He had done it. He calmly rolled his old tools back into their leather pouch, tucked it into his pocket, and stood up. He stepped back from the mine, his work complete. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, stunned silence, filled with the sudden, violent recalibration of reality. The trainees stared, their mouths agape. They had just witnessed something impossible, a display of mastery so complete, so effortless, that it bordered on magic. Riley's face was the color of ash. His arrogance had been systematically dismantled and utterly destroyed. He was a child who had just watched a god at work. Lieutenant Commander Evans was the first to move. He walked slowly toward the mine, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning, incredible respect. He knelt and examined Vernon's work. He saw the disabled mechanisms, the bypass traps. He looked up at the old man, who now stood quietly, his composure perfectly intact. Evans's gaze fell to the faded tattoo on Vernon's forearm. The crab holding the dynamite. It all clicked into place. NCDU, Evans breathed, his voice filled with an awe that bordered on reverence. Naval Combat Demolition Unit, he stood up and faced the stunned trainees. You know who this is? This is a frogman. One of the originals. From Korea. The revelation hit the young SEALs like a physical blow. They were looking at living history. They were standing in the presence of a man who had helped invent their profession, a man whose exploits were the stuff of legend taught in their history classes. The janitor they had mocked, the old man they had tormented, was one of the founding fathers of their tribe. The weight of their own ignorance and disrespect settled on them, a crushing, shameful burden. Just as the full impact of the moment was settling in, the sound of an engine broke the silence. A black government SUV with tinted windows rolled to a stop at the edge of the range. The driver's side door opened, and a man emerged who seemed to block out the sun. He was tall, broad, and his uniform was adorned with the gold star and anchors of a Master Chief Petty Officer. Every ribbon and medal on his chest told a story of valor and decades of service. This was Master Chief Thorne, a legend in his own right, a plank owner of SEAL Team 6, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, respectful tones in every corner of the special warfare community. Thorne had come to observe the final phase of Evans's historical training module. His eyes, sharp and accustomed to assessing everything in a single glance, took in the scene, the disarmed mine, the shell-shocked trainees, the pale-faced Riley, and the quiet old janitor standing apart from them all. His gaze swept past the others and locked onto Vernon Ford. A flicker of disbelief, followed by a wave of profound recognition, crossed the Master Chief's face. His entire demeanor, already ramrod straight and disciplined, somehow became even more rigid. He snapped his heels together with a sharp crack. He raised his hand to his brow and rendered the crispest, most respectful salute of his long and decorated career. Mr. Ford, Thorne's voice boomed across the silent range, a gravelly thunder that commanded absolute attention. It is an honor, sir. The word, sir, hung in the air, electric and impossible. Master Chiefs did not salute janitors. Master Chiefs did not call janitors sir, they were the highest-ranking enlisted personnel in the Navy, figures of immense authority and respect. For Thorne to offer such a gesture was a complete inversion of the known universe. Cade Riley looked as if he might physically collapse. The world no longer made sense. Thorne held the salute for a moment longer before dropping his hand. He walked forward, his eyes never leaving Vernon's. He turned to the stunned and confused Petty Officer Riley. Report, Instructor, Thorne commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerously low temperature. Riley stammered, his tongue suddenly thick and useless in his mouth. Master Chief. We were running a historical ordnance drill. Thorne cut him off with a slice of his hand. I know what you were running. And I know what you've been doing for the last 6 weeks. I read the custodial incident reports. Spills. Equipment damage. General harassment. Your name kept appearing next to Mr. Ford's. I came here today to see for myself what kind of instructor would spend his time tormenting a janitor. He turned his icy gaze to Lieutenant Commander Evans. Commander, what is the first, last, and most important principle of a SEAL? Evans, recovering from his own shock, answered without hesitation. Honor, Master Chief. Honor, Thorne repeated, letting the word sink in. He turned back to the trembling Riley. You have none. You dishonored yourself. You dishonored your trainees. You dishonored this uniform. And worst of all, you dishonored a man whose boots you are not worthy to clean, let alone speak to. Thorne took a step closer to Riley, his immense presence seeming to suck all the air from around him. Do you have any idea who this is? This is Vernon Ford. At the Incheon landings, when he was 19 years old, he and his team swam through mined waters in the middle of the night and cleared a channel for the entire invasion force. He did it with a knife, a roll of duct tape, and a pair of pliers. He cleared more live ordnance in a single night than you will see in your entire pampered, high-tech career. He is a piece of our history. A history you saw fit to spit on. The Master Chief's voice dropped to a lethal whisper, a promise of cold, bureaucratic vengeance. You are relieved of all instructor duties, effective immediately. Pack your personal items. You are being reassigned to Fleet Logistics Center, Aleutian Islands. You'll be chipping ice off a supply buoy and counting shipping containers for the next 3 years. Maybe in the cold and the dark, you'll find a piece of the honor you lost. Now get out of my sight. Dismissed. Cade Riley stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of utter devastation. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. He had been publicly broken and cast out by a living icon of the community he so desperately wanted to lead. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his swagger gone, replaced by the broken shuffle of a defeated man. The trainees did not watch him go. Their eyes, and their respect, were now fixed on one person. As the disgraced Riley disappeared, a heavy silence returned to the range. It was finally broken by one of the trainees, a young man who had been one of the most frequent snickerers at Riley's jokes. He stepped forward from the group, his face etched with a deep and genuine shame. He came to a halt in front of Vernon. "Mr. Ford," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "On behalf of all of us, I'm sorry. We were wrong. We didn't know." Vernon looked at the young men, then at the faces of the others. He saw their remorse, their newfound awe. He simply gave a slow, understanding nod. It was all the forgiveness they needed, and more than they deserved. Master Chief Thorne approached Vernon, his own expression softening from righteous fury to deep respect. "Vernon," he said, his voice back to a normal, conversational tone. "It's good to see you, even under these circumstances. The Admiral heard you were working down here. He sends his personal regards. He also wanted me to ask. He wants to know if you'd consider coming on as a special consultant. A guest lecturer for this historical ordnance module. These boys need to learn from the real thing. We'd be honored to have you." It was an incredible offer. A chance to be recognized, to be brought back into the fold, to be given the public status he had earned decades ago. Vernon looked at the disarmed mine, a relic from his past. He looked at the humbled, hopeful faces of the next generation of frogmen. He looked at Master Chief Thorne, a link to the world he had left behind. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Vernon Ford's lips. "I appreciate the offer, Master Chief. I truly do," he paused, his gaze drifting toward the custodial cart he had left at the edge of the range. "But I'm happy with my mop. Keeps me busy." He looked back at Thorne, a twinkle in his weary eyes. "But I'll think about it." With that, he gave a final nod to the assembled men, turned, and walked back to his cart. He picked up his bucket and his mop. The trainees parted for him like the Red Sea, their eyes following him with a reverence they usually reserved for admirals and Medal of Honor recipients. He was no longer an invisible fixture. He was a monument. Vernon Ford, NCDU frogman and Korean War legend, began mopping the dust from the concrete, his movements as quiet, methodical, and dignified as ever. He was a silent hero who had chosen to continue serving in his own quiet way, content in the knowledge that a job done right was its own reward. And for the young men of the platoon, the lesson they learned that day on the demolition range was the most important of their lives. It was not about how to disarm a bomb. It was about honor, humility, and the quiet greatness that can be found in the most unexpected of places.